The footprints lie in the old lake bed like a message pressed into wet earth and then sealed by time. Not carved into stone, not buried with weapons, not arranged as a monument, but simply left behind by people walking across a pale, muddy shore while the Ice Age world breathes around them. The lake is gone now. The water has withdrawn. The grasslands have changed. The animals that once crossed those margins have vanished, and the people who made those tracks are beyond the reach of names. Yet for a moment, when the light falls across the hardened surface, their presence feels almost impossible to deny. Heel, arch, toe, a stride, a pause, a direction. Human beings moving through a landscape that, for a very long time, many scholars believed no human being should have reached so early. This is where the mystery begins, not with a skull in a museum drawer or a spear point held under glass, but with the unsettling simplicity of feet in mud. In what is now North America, traces of ancient walkers have forced archaeologists to widen the frame of the story. The old version was once elegant in its simplicity. People came from Northeast Asia near the end of the last ice age, crossed a land bridge exposed by low seas, travelled south when the ice allowed passage, and spread rapidly through a continent filled with great animals. In that version, the first widely recognised archaeological culture was Clovis, known for its beautifully made fluted stone points, sharp enough to enter both flesh and imagination. For decades, Clovis seemed to stand at the doorway of American history, a people appearing around 13,000 years ago with unmistakable tools, impressive skill, and a continent before them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. But the ground has not cooperated with a simple story. Across the Americas, evidence has appeared that seems to push human presence farther back, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by millennia, and sometimes into a period that feels almost disorienting. In Chile, in Oregon, in Texas, in Florida, in New Mexico, and at scattered places between and beyond them, archaeologists have found objects, sediments, bones, hearths, tracks, and possible traces of activity that do not fit neatly into the old doorway. Some are accepted more widely than others, some remain debated, some have survived decades of criticism and retesting, others sit uneasily at the edge of certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and in early American archaeology, incompleteness is not an exception. It is the condition of the field itself. The reason is partly the age of the question. The earliest human presence in the Americas lies near the edge of what archaeology can preserve clearly. Camps were often temporary. Tools could be simple. Food remains decay. Fires scatter. Rivers cut through old surfaces. Glaciers grind landscapes into fragments. Coastlines drown when the seas rise. A place where people once stopped to repair a tool, roast a meal, scrape a hide, or gather around a fire may now be beneath meters of ocean. Buried under alluvium, broken by erosion, or invisible beneath a modern city. The first Americans did not know they were leaving evidence for a distant future. They were simply trying to live. Still, some traces survive with an intimacy that no stone point can fully match. Footprints are strangely personal. A spear point can tell us about design, skill, hunting, exchange, and tradition. But a footprint records the weight of a body at a particular instant. It tells us that someone crossed there, not as an abstract population, not as a migration arrow on a map, but as a living person at white sands, where ancient tracks have drawn intense attention. Some prints appear small enough to suggest children or adolescents moving through a wet landscape visited by mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, camels, and other animals of the late Pleistocene world. Scholars still debate details of dating and interpretation at many early sites, but the broader effect of such evidence has been profound. It makes the first Americans harder to imagine as a sudden arrival. They begin to look more like people already learning the land, already moving through it, already belonging to it in ways that leave only fragile signs behind. To stand mentally in that vanished landscape is to step into a continent both familiar and alien. North America is colder in many places, yet not everywhere locked in ice. Great ice sheets dominate the north, thick enough to reshape the planet's climate and pin down so much water that sea levels fall far below the modern shore. Alaska and Siberia are joined by Beringia, a vast exposed land rather than a narrow bridge, a place of steppe, shrub, wind, animals, and possibly generations of human life. South of the ice, open plains stretch beneath wide skies, grasslands shift, wetlands appear and disappear, herds move across seasonal ranges, rivers change course, forests creep and retreat. The whole world seems to breathe in colder rhythms. Human beings entering this world would not have experienced it as a blank continent waiting to be discovered. That is a later illusion, made by maps and hindsight. To them, it would have been a chain of immediate problems and possibilities. Where is fresh water? Where do animals move when the weather turns? Which stone breaks cleanly? Which plants are edible? Which valley traps cold air? Which river can be crossed? Which shoreline gives shellfish, fish, birds, and driftwood? Which strangers are dangerous and which might become kin? What survives in the record suggests mobility, skill, and adaptation, not wandering without knowledge. Even the earliest accepted evidence points to people capable of reading landscapes with precision. The mystery grows deeper because the phrase "the first Americans" sounds more singular than the evidence allows. It suggests one people, one moment, one crossing, one clear beginning. Yet archaeology and genetics increasingly point toward a more complicated human story. There may have been pauses, separations, expansions, bottlenecks, and routes that left uneven traces. Some groups may have moved swiftly along coasts, others may have waited in northern refuges. Some may have pushed into interior corridors only when ice, water, plants, and animals made the route possible. Others may have followed shorelines now hidden under the sea. No single explanation fully accounts for all the clues, and that is exactly why the story has remained so magnetic. It is not only a story of arrival, it is a story of evidence appearing, vanishing, and returning in unexpected forms. For much of the 20th century, the Clovis people seemed to offer a satisfying answer because their tools were so visible and widespread. Their fluted points appear across large parts of North America, often associated with big game hunting and the dramatic world of mammoths and mastodons. They were not primitive wanderers. Their stonework was refined, deliberate, and technically demanding. The makers of Clovis points understood fracture, symmetry, edge, and risk, because a single mistake could ruin hours of work. In the archaeological record, that kind of technology announces itself loudly. It is easy to see, easy to classify, and powerful enough to build a model around. But the earliest leaves in the Americas may not always have announced themselves loudly. The people before Clovis, or outside Clovis, may have used different technologies, different materials, or different strategies. They may have made tools from bone, wood, fibre, and plant materials that rarely survive. They may have lived in places where later water erased their camps. They may have relied heavily on coastal resources, leaving evidence now submerged. They may have hunted smaller animals, gathered plants, trapped birds, fished rivers, collected shellfish, or moved through environments in ways that did not produce the dramatic kill sites early archaeologists expected. The absence of obvious evidence is not the same as the absence of people, though archaeology must be careful never to turn that caution into fantasy. This is where the central question begins to shift. It is not simply, who were the first Americans? It is also, why do some of them seem to disappear? Not disappear like a vanished city swallowed whole in a legend, but disappear from the forms by which archaeologists try to recognize people. A tool tradition fades, a genetic lineage narrows or blends, a site type vanishes, a migration route drowns, a population becomes ancestral to later peoples but loses its earlier shape. Another group may leave only faint traces, then becomes absorbed into communities whose descendants survive in different ways. Disappearance in deep history is often not an ending. Sometimes it is transformation seen from too far away. That distinction matters because the first Americans are not a dead puzzle detached from the present. They're tied to living indigenous peoples, to histories of belonging, to scientific debates that carry ethical weight, and to the deep human truth that ancestry is not always visible in the objects left behind. Ancient DNA has begun to reveal movements and connections that stone alone could not show. But DNA also complicates the story rather than closing it. It reveals survival where archaeology once saw replacement. It reveals mixture where older models imagined clean separation. It reveals that some people can seem to vanish from one kind of evidence while continuing in another. And so the footprints remain powerful because they resist abstraction. They do not tell the whole story. They do not name a culture. They do not explain every migration, every extinction, every genetic pattern, or every vanished shoreline. But they place human presence into a landscape older than certainty. They ask us to imagine children and adults crossing wet ground, while enormous animals move nearby and ice shapes the world to the north. They ask us to accept that the beginning was not a single bright line. It was a long threshold, crossed by real people whose lives were full of hunger, weather, skill, danger, memory, and choice. The mystery of why the first Americans disappeared begins with the possibility that they never disappeared in the simple way the phrase suggests. They stepped into the record unevenly, and the record, damaged by time, has been trying to catch up ever since. To understand the first Americans, the story has to move north, toward a place that no longer exists in the form that once mattered most. It lies beneath the modern seas between Siberia and Alaska, hidden under cold water where grey waves now pass over a vanished world. During the last ice age, when so much of Earth's water is trapped inside glaciers and continental ice sheets, sea levels fall dramatically. The shallow floor of the Bering and Chukchi seas rises into air. Asia and North America are joined, not by a narrow bridge like a road from one continent to another, but by a vast region of exposed land, broad enough to be a homeland in itself. This is Beringia, and it is one of the most important missing landscapes in human history. The word land bridge can mislead the imagination. It makes Beringia sound like a temporary crossing point, a frozen corridor used quickly by people moving with purpose from one known world into another unknown one. But what survives in the record suggests something stranger and more human. Beringia was not merely a bridge, it was a place. It had rivers, valleys, uplands, wetlands, dry steppe, patches of shrubs, and open ground where animals grazed and migrated. It connected northeastern Asia to northwestern North America, across a region that may have stretched more than 1,000 miles from north to south at certain moments. People living there would not have thought of themselves as standing between continents. They would have known ridges, winds, animal trails, stone sources, seasonal camps, and the hard logic of survival in a cold but living land. This matters because the earliest peopling of the Americas may not have happened as a single rush southward. One influential idea, often called the Beringian standstill or Beringian incubation model, suggests that ancestral Native American populations may have spent a long period separated from other Northeast Asian peoples somewhere in or around Beringia before expanding into the Americas. Scholars still debate the timing, location, and details, but the basic idea helps explain why the genetic ancestry of indigenous peoples of the Americas shows deep roots that are related to Asia yet distinct from later populations there. In this view, the beginning of the American story is not only a crossing, it is also a pause, perhaps lasting thousands of years, during which a population becomes shaped by isolation, climate, and time. Beringia during the Ice Age is often imagined as bleak, and in some ways it was. Winters could be severe. Winds moved across open ground without mercy. The sun stayed low for long stretches. The land did not offer the thick forests familiar in warmer periods. Yet it was not simply a dead frozen desert. Because parts of Beringia were too dry to support massive ice sheets, much of the region remained unglaciated. Instead of being buried under ice, it held a mosaic of steppe tundra environments sometimes called the Mammoth Steppe, a cold grassland world that supported grazing animals in astonishing numbers. Mammoths, horses, bison, musk oxen, caribou, and other animals moved through this exposed country, along with predators that followed them. For mobile hunter-gatherers with the right knowledge, such a place could be dangerous and demanding, but not empty. The surprising detail is that Beringia may also have offered refuges when surrounding regions became harsher. Pollen, plant remains, insect evidence, and climate models suggest that some parts of the region included productive pockets where shrubs, grasses, and seasonal resources could support animals and humans alike. The landscape was not uniformly generous, but hunter-gatherers do not require farmland or permanent abundance. They require knowledge, movement, cooperation, and the ability to make use of scattered resources. A river valley with fish, a patch of edible roots, a migration route for caribou, a place where animals can be ambushed, a source of good stone, a sheltered camp behind a rise in the land. These could be enough to turn a severe world into a livable one. Still, Beringia was not an easy doorway into the rest of North America. To the south and east, enormous ice sheets covered much of Canada. The Laurentide ice sheet spread over the eastern centre of the continent, while the Cordilleran ice sheet covered mountain regions along the west. At times, these ice masses met or nearly met, blocking movement into the interior. This is why the timing of migration matters so intensely. If people were in Beringia before a usable route opened southward, they may have been held there, not by choice alone, but by geography on a continental scale. To the north lay Arctic coast and cold ocean. To the south lay ice. To the west lay the lands of Asia already known in some ancestral sense. To the east lay Alaska and the edge of a continent whose interior may have been inaccessible for generations. This gives the story a different emotional shape. The first Americans may not have been explorers in the simple heroic sense, marching across an exposed bridge and immediately claiming a hemisphere. They may have been families living at the edge of possibility for a very long time, adapting to a northern world while climate slowly opened and closed the doors around them. Children could have been born in Beringia, grown old there, and died there without ever seeing the lands far to the south. Their descendants may have carried memories of routes, animals, coastlines, and camps that are now underwater. If so, one of the great homelands of early American ancestry has been erased from view, not by conquest or fire, but by the return of the sea. When the climate begins to shift and the ice sheets change, Beringia becomes not only a refuge but a launching ground. The exact path out remains debated. Some groups may have moved along the Pacific coast, following shorelines rich in marine resources, kelp forests, fish, shellfish, birds, sea mammals, driftwood, and freshwater streams. Others may have moved later through an interior corridor between retreating ice sheets. Though whether that corridor was open and ecologically useful early enough for the first major movement remains a central question. The evidence remains incomplete because the most promising coastal routes of the late Ice Age are now submerged. The beaches, estuaries, and camps that might explain the earlier southward expansion may lie beneath the ocean, beyond ordinary archaeology. Beringia also helps explain why the story of disappearance is so complicated. If early populations lived in a landscape that later drowned, then an entire chapter of their material record was swallowed. Their camps, hearths, tools, butchered bones, and burial places may have vanished beneath rising water as the glaciers melted and seas climbed. Archaeologists are left searching the surviving edges, like trying to reconstruct a book from the margins after the central pages have dissolved. This loss can make a people seem sudden when they were gradual, absent when they were present, or vanished when the ground that held their story simply no longer exists. The sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age is not a small background detail, it transforms the map. As glaciers melt, the land connection between Asia and North America disappears. Beringia breaks apart into separated shores and islands. The route that once allowed animals and humans to move across dry ground becomes a marine barrier. The homeland, if homeland it was, becomes memory and seabed. Groups already south of the ice continue adapting to new environments, spreading through valleys, plains, coasts, forests, and deserts. Groups remaining in the north face changing ecologies and shifting coastlines. The old world is not simply left behind, it is physically removed. And yet Beringia survives in another form. It survives in genetic patterns, in archaeological questions, in indigenous histories connected to northern lands, and in the stubborn fact that the Americas cannot be understood without a place that is mostly missing. The mystery of the first Americans is therefore built on absence from the beginning. A vanished land helps create a people whose earliest story is partly hidden. The first footprints farther south are only the visible edge of something larger, older, and more difficult to recover. Before people walked across those ancient lake beds, before Clovis points appeared, before camps spread through the Americas, there was this exposed northern world between continents, holding human lives under a cold sky while the ice decided when the rest of the hemisphere could be entered. South of that drowned northern world, the archaeological story once seemed to begin with a clean, sharp edge of stone. For much of the 20th century, that edge belonged to Clovis. The name came from a place in New Mexico, near Blackwater Draw, where finely made spear points appeared with the bones of extinct Ice Age animals. They were not crude tools. They were elegant, thin, carefully shaped, and marked by a distinctive channel flake removed from the base, creating the famous flute that made them instantly recognizable. In museum cases and excavation reports, they seem to announce a people of astonishing skill arriving at exactly the right dramatic moment, the end of the Ice Age, the opening of the continent, the last great days of mammoths, and the beginning of human history in the Americas. The Clovis idea had the force of simplicity. Around 13,000 years ago, people crossed from Asia into Alaska, moved south through an ice-free corridor between the great glaciers, entered the open plains of North America, and spread with remarkable speed. Their tools appeared across a huge area, from the American West to the East Coast, from the northern plains into parts of Mexico. Their technology was distinctive enough to trace. Their association with mammoths and other large animals gave the story energy and consequence. Here, it seemed, were the first Americans mobile hunters entering a new world, carrying a powerful weapon system and leaving behind a stone signature unlike anything that came before it. For decades, this model became more than a theory. It became a gate through which evidence had to pass. A site older than Clovis was not impossible in principle, but it had to survive extreme scrutiny. Archaeologists had good reasons for caution. Early dates can be misleading. Charcoal can move through sediments. Natural stones can look worked by human hands. Animal bones can break in ways that resemble butchery. A younger artifact can sink into older layers. An older piece of wood can be burned long after the tree died. The evidence remains incomplete even at well-excavated sites, and in the search for the first people on a continent, a single mistake can create a false beginning. So skepticism was not only stubbornness, it was a defense against wishful thinking. Yet over time, the defense became a wall. Claims of older sites were often dismissed quickly, sometimes because the evidence was weak, but sometimes because the Clovis first model had grown so comfortable that anything older seemed almost unreasonable before it was fully considered. The result was a strange tension. On one side stood a clean, visible, continent-wide stone technology. On the other stood scattered hints that people might have been present earlier, but in ways less dramatic, less standardized, and harder to recognize. The first Americans may not have left behind the kind of evidence archaeologists had trained themselves to expect. That is one of the hidden lessons in the breaking of Clovis certainty. Archaeology often depends on what survives clearly enough to be counted. Clovis survived clearly. Its points are beautiful, durable, and distinctive. They belong to a technological tradition that can be mapped. But earlier people, if they used more varied tools or relied more heavily on bone, wood, fibre, basketry, nets, simple flakes, digging sticks, or coastal equipment, may have left traces that are easier to overlook. A fish trap can vanish, a wooden spear can rot, a hide shelter can leave little behind. A shell midden can be drowned by rising seas. A stone flake can look unimpressive beside a fluted point, even if it once belonged to a life just as complex. The first cracks in the old model did not come all at once. They appeared as a slow unease, site by site, date by date. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania produced evidence that some researchers argued was older than Clovis, though debates over contamination and dating followed it for years. Paisley Caves in Oregon later offered human coprolites, dried feces, with ancient DNA and dates suggesting people were present before or around the early Clovis horizon, though even there. Scholars examined the evidence with intense care. In Texas, at the Buttermilk Creek complex near the better-known Gault site, stone tools appeared beneath Clovis layers, suggesting an older occupation. In Florida, Page Ladson produced evidence of human activity associated with a mastodon tusk in sediments older than Clovis. Each case carried its own arguments, doubts, and revisions. No single site broke the wall by itself. Instead, the wall weakened because too many cracks began to line up. Radiocarbon dating played a central role, but it did not act like a magic key. Dates have to be tied securely to human activity. A piece of charcoal is not enough unless it belongs clearly to a hearth or an occupation layer. A bone date matters only if the bone's relationship to tools or cut marks is solid. A layer must be understood, not merely sampled. The problem is that ancient sites are not sealed boxes. They are living geological systems. Water moves, animals burrow, roots penetrate. Freeze and thaw disturb sediments. Humans revisit places over thousands of years. What looks like a simple layer cake can turn out to be a disturbed mixture. This is why the debate over early sites became so fierce. The question was never only whether an object was old. It was whether the human action connected to it was truly old. As more evidence accumulated, Clovis began to change shape in the story. It no longer looked like the first human presence in the Americas. It began to look more like one brilliant and widespread tradition among people already here. That shift is profound. Clovis did not become less impressive. If anything, it became more interesting. Instead of being the toolkit of the first arrivals, it may represent a rapid technological expansion within established populations facing particular opportunities and pressures near the end of the Pleistocene. Its makers may have been descendants of earlier groups, innovators within a changing world, people adapting to open landscapes and large prey at a moment when climate and animals were both unstable. There is also a surprising brevity to the Clovis horizon. For all its fame, the classic Clovis period seems to have lasted only a few centuries. Its points spread widely. Then the tradition changes and gives way to other regional forms. That short span makes its archaeological visibility even more remarkable. A technology that lasted perhaps only several human lifetimes came to dominate the imagined beginning of an entire hemisphere. This is not because archaeologists were foolish. It is because Clovis left a loud signal, and the older signals were quiet. In deep history, loud evidence can easily be mistaken for first evidence. The collapse of Clovis first did not produce a new simple answer. It produced a more difficult landscape. If people were present before Clovis, how much earlier did they arrive? Were there multiple movements? Did some early populations fail, leaving little genetic legacy? Did others survive and become ancestors of later indigenous peoples? Did coastal groups move quickly down the Pacific edge while interior groups spread later? Scholars still debate these questions because the evidence does not line up into a single neat path. Some claims of very early human presence remain controversial. Some may eventually be rejected. Others may grow stronger with new methods. The field has learned caution, but it has also learned humility. What changed most was not one date on a timeline. It was the idea of what the first Americans had to look like archaeologically. They did not need to arrive with Clovis points in their hands. They did not need to enter only when the ice-free corridor was fully open. They did not need to appear suddenly as a continent-wide culture. They may have arrived earlier, moved differently, lived in smaller groups, used less visible technologies, followed coastlines now underwater, and adapted to local worlds long before Clovis became visible on the plains. The breaking of Clovis certainty is therefore not a story of one theory being humiliated by another. It is a story of the past becoming less obedient. The sharp stone point remains in the hand, still beautiful, still important, but it no longer marks the first page. It marks a page already deep inside the book. Before it, there are footprints, hearths, bones, flakes, possible camps, drowned coasts, and questions that refuse to settle. The first Americans do not emerge from the darkness all at once. They come into view unevenly, as if seen through moving ice, and every older trace makes the mystery less tidy and more human. Far to the south, beyond the ice sheets, beyond the plains where Clovis points first captured scientific attention, beyond deserts, mountains, and forests. A damp place in southern Chile began to change the entire story. Monte Verde does not look like the doorway to a continent-wide revolution. It is not a dramatic cave high in a cliff, or a field of mammoth bones spread under a western sky. It lies in a wet, wooded landscape, in a region where water, peat, and low oxygen helped preserve things that usually vanish. That preservation is part of why the site became so powerful. In most ancient camps, time eats the soft evidence first, wood disappears, plant fibers decay, hides rot, food scraps return to soil. But at Monte Verde, the ground kept traces that archaeology is rarely allowed to see. The people who stopped there more than 14,000 years ago left behind a world that felt startlingly lived in. Not just a scatter of stone tools, but remnants of wooden structures, plant remains, hearths, possible medicinal plants, chewed seaweed, pieces of hide, and traces of food gathered from different environments. It was not the image of a few hunters racing south behind mammoths. It looked more like a small community that understood its surroundings intimately. They knew wood, water, edible plants, fire, animal resources, and the practical value of a sheltered camp. What survives in the record suggests planning and familiarity, not desperate improvisation at the edge of an unknown world. Monte Verde mattered because of where it was. Southern Chile is not close to Beringia. It is not near Alaska. It is not even near the middle of the Americas. It lies deep in South America, thousands of miles from the northern entry points that older models imagined. If people were living there around 14,500 years ago, then human beings had already travelled an immense distance through the Americas before that date. They had crossed or skirted ecosystems that were not uniform cold margins. Mountains, river valleys, coastal zones, deserts, forests, grasslands, and tropical regions. They had adapted again and again. The implication was unavoidable. The first arrival in the Americas had to be earlier than Monte Verde itself. This was why the site struck so hard against Clovis. First thinking, Clovis, at around 13,000 years ago, could no longer be the beginning if people were already settled far to the south more than 1,000 years earlier. 1,000 years is easy to say, but in human terms it is enormous. It is 40 generations, perhaps more. It is enough time for children to grow old, for roots to become remembered, for local knowledge to accumulate, for families to split, for technologies to shift, for stories to attach themselves to rivers and forests. If Monte Verde was real, then the first American story had deeper roots than the Clovis model allowed. At first, not everyone accepted it. The skepticism was intense and in some ways predictable. For a site to overturn a major model, it must carry a heavy burden. Archaeologists examined the dating, the layers, the artifacts, the association between objects and human activity, the possibility of disturbance, and the interpretation of unusual remains. Some doubts were fair. Extraordinary implications require careful work, but over time, Monte Verde survived a level of scrutiny that would have crushed a weaker site. It became one of the best known and most widely accepted pre-Clovis sites in the Americas. The old gate did not fall because people stopped caring about evidence. It fell because this evidence was too strong to keep outside. One of the lesser-known surprises of Monte Verde is the diversity of plant material found there. The people at the site appear to have used plants from different ecological zones, including some that may have come from coastal areas. Seaweed and other marine-linked resources suggest either direct movement to the coast or exchange and travel across a wider landscape than a single inland camp might imply. This detail does not prove a full coastal migration route by itself, but it adds texture to the possibility that early peoples were not bound to one kind of environment. They may have moved between forest, wetland, and shore, gathering resources with a flexibility that stone tools alone would never reveal. The camp itself has a striking human scale. The remains have been interpreted as evidence for shelters, perhaps made with wooden stakes and hides or other covering materials, arranged in a way that suggests repeated use or organized occupation. There were hearths, places where fire changed food, warmed bodies, hardened materials, and created a center around which life could briefly gather. There were pieces of wood shaped or used by human hands. There were stones brought from elsewhere. There were traces of mastodon meat or tissue. Though Monte Verde is not simply a big game kill site, it is more complex than that, and more revealing. It shows people using a wet forested world, not merely chasing enormous animals across open plains. That difference matters. For a long time, the imagined first Americans were often pictured as specialized hunters of megafauna, moving across a continent of giant prey. There is truth in the association between some early peoples and large animals, but Monte Verde widens the lens. It shows that very early communities could rely on broad-spectrum strategies: plants, smaller animals, wood, water, possibly marine foods, and local materials. Their survival was not built only on the dramatic moment of a spear entering a mammoth. It was built on ordinary knowledge, repeated daily: which root can be eaten, which branch bends without breaking, which damp ground will hold a post, which firewood burns in wet weather, which season brings which food, which path leads back. The site also reminds us how much the archaeological record depends on luck. Monte Verde survived because wet conditions protected fragile remains. In a drier or more disturbed place, the same people might have left almost nothing recognizable. Their wooden tools would have decayed. Their plant use would have disappeared. Their shelters would have faded into stains too faint to read. Archaeologists might have found only a few stones and argued for years about whether they meant anything. No single explanation fully accounts for the unevenness of the earliest evidence because preservation itself is uneven. Some landscapes become archives, others become silence. There is an emotional weight in imagining Monte Verde not as a data point, but as a pause in a long movement. The people there may not have thought of themselves as pioneers at the end of a migration. They may have known the region as home, or as part of a seasonal round, or as a familiar stop along a network of places. Children may have crouched near fires while rain tapped against coverings. Adults may have worked wood, prepared food, repaired tools, watched the surrounding forest, and listened for animals moving beyond the camp. The air would have been damp, the ground soft, smoke would have hung low. This was not an empty continent receiving its first visitors. It was a place already woven into human routines. The deeper implication is that the peopling of the Americas must have involved speed and time at once. Speed, because reaching southern Chile by 14,500 years ago means people expanded across huge distances earlier than once believed. Time, because such an expansion likely required knowledge passed through generations, not a blind sprint. It may have involved movement along coastlines, river systems, or a combination of pathways. but the evidence remains incomplete. The exact route to Monte Verde is still debated, and the site does not solve the entire mystery. Instead, it forces the mystery to become larger. Monte Verde changed everything because it turned the map upside down. Instead of beginning in the north and slowly tracing a simple march south, archaeologists had to look at a camp near the far end of the hemisphere and work backward. If people were here, then where had they been before? How long had they been moving? What evidence has vanished under the sea, under forests, under rivers, under later occupations? What other Monteverdes are still hidden or already destroyed? The site did not answer the question of why some early Americans disappeared, but it made one thing clear: any disappearance happened within a story much older, wider, and more complex than Clovis alone. The people of Monte Verde stand in the wet earth as a warning against simple beginnings, preserved not as a grand monument, but as the remains of a camp where ancient lives once continued under rain. From the wet ground of Monte Verde, the trail bends backward across a hemisphere. It does not lead in a straight line. It breaks into fragments, turns toward mountains, vanishes beneath forests, runs along drowned shorelines, and disappears under ice that is no longer there. If people were in southern Chile more than 14,000 years ago, then the question becomes less about whether they moved south and more about how they moved through a world that seemed, at first glance, almost designed to block them. North America near the end of the Ice Age was not an open doorway. It was a continent with enormous frozen walls, shifting coastlines, dangerous weather, and routes that appeared and vanished with climate. The first Americans did not simply cross into a new land. They had to find a way through a changing planet. For a long time, the most familiar answer was the ice-free corridor. On maps, it looks convincing. Two great ice sheets, the Laurentide to the east and the Cordilleran to the west, once covered much of northern North America. As the climate changed, a gap opened between them, running down through what is now Western Canada. In theory, people entering from Beringia could have moved through that corridor into the interior plains, then spread across the rest of the continent. The model fit neatly with Clovis' first thinking because it placed the opening of the route near the time when Clovis people appeared widely in North America. It was tidy, geographic, and easy to draw land bridge, corridor, plains, continent. But landscapes are not made usable simply because ice retreats on a map. A corridor between glaciers might be open in the sense that it is no longer buried under thousands of feet of ice, yet still be nearly impossible for human travel. It needs plants. It needs animals. It needs fresh water, fuel, shelter, and enough ecological stability for people to move through without starving. A newly exposed corridor can be raw, flooded, unstable, and poor in resources. Glacial lakes may block passage. Meltwater rivers may rage across loose ground. Vegetation may take time to return. Herd animals may not yet have established routes. What looks like a path from above may be a trap when seen from the ground. This is why the timing of the ice-free corridor became such a serious problem. Many researchers now argue that the corridor was probably not a viable first route early enough to explain sites such as Monte Verde, though scholars still debate the details of when different parts became passable and livable. It may have played an important role later, allowing movement north and south within the continent after people were already present below the ice. But as the original highway into the Americas, it seems increasingly difficult to make it work for the earliest accepted evidence. The corridor did not vanish from the story. It changed roles. It became less like the first doorway and more like one route among several, perhaps opening after other human movements had already reshaped the map. The alternative points west, toward the Pacific coast. The coastal migration idea imagines people moving along the edge of the sea, travelling by foot, by boat, or by some combination of shoreline movement and short water crossings. Instead of pushing through a barren corridor between ice sheets, early groups may have followed a chain of coastal habitats from Beringia down the Pacific Rim, using marine resources and moving between sheltered places. The phrase sometimes attached to this idea is the kelp highway, because kelp forest ecosystems can support rich webs of life fish, shellfish, sea mammals, birds, and edible seaweeds, along with driftwood and other useful materials. A coastline can be dangerous, but it can also be generous in a way that inland ice margins are not. This coastal route does not require people to have been deep-sea sailors in the later heroic sense. It requires something more modest and, in some ways, more plausible comfort with shorelines, tides, estuaries, boats or rafts where needed, and the ability to read marine landscapes. By the late Pleistocene, modern humans elsewhere in the world had already reached islands and crossed water gaps, so water travel in some form was well within human capacity. The first Americans may have used skin boats, wooden craft, reed bundles, or other technologies that leave little trace. The evidence remains incomplete, because the most obvious materials for such equipment decay quickly, and the shorelines they used are mostly not where modern shorelines are today. That is the coastal route's great strength and weakness. It explains how people could move relatively quickly into the Americas before the interior corridor became fully useful. It fits the deep southern date at Monte Verde better than a late opening inland passage. It also matches the idea that early people were flexible foragers who could exploit marine and terrestrial resources. But the route is hard to prove because the late Ice Age coast has been transformed. Sea levels were far lower when people first moved along those edges. As glaciers melted, the ocean rose and covered ancient beaches, river mouths, estuaries, campsites, and travel corridors. Many of the places that could hold the clearest evidence may now lie beneath tens or even more than 100 meters of water. A lesser-known detail is that parts of the Pacific coast may have been more complex than a simple strip between ice and ocean. There were islands, exposed shelves, glacial margins, refuges, and pockets of habitable land that changed through time. In some areas, glaciers reached the sea and made travel difficult. In others, sections of coast may have remained ice-free or became habitable earlier than once assumed. People moving through such a world would not have followed a smooth line southward. They may have advanced, paused, retreated, crossed short channels, moved inland up rivers, returned to the shore, and followed seasonal windows. The route may have been less a highway than a braided network of possibilities. The Channel Islands off California offer a later glimpse of what coastal adaptation could look like, though they do not date to the earliest entry itself. Early sites there show people using marine resources and watercraft-capable movement by around 13,000 years ago. That matters because it demonstrates that, not long after the earliest known expansion, people on the Pacific edge were already skilled in coastal living, farther north. Scattered evidence from Alaska and the Pacific Northwest continues to complicate the old picture. Though preservation and access remain difficult, what survives in the record suggests that the coast cannot be treated as a marginal possibility. It may have been central. Yet the inland route should not be dismissed too neatly. Human history rarely obeys a single arrow. Once the ice-free corridor became ecologically viable, it could have allowed movement in both directions. People already south of the ice may have moved northward. Northern groups may have moved southward. Animals moved, plants recolonized, and landscapes opened. The corridor may have become a meeting ground rather than a first entrance, a place where populations, technologies, and knowledge move through a changing interior. If the earliest Americans arrived by the coast, later Americans may still have used the corridor extensively. The debate is not simply coast against corridor, it is about timing, sequence, and the different roles routes played as the world thawed. Rivers add another layer. Once people entered parts of the continent, river systems would have offered pathways through difficult terrain. Rivers provide water, animals, fish, plants, stone exposures, and natural lines of movement. They cut through mountains, open into plains, and connect ecological zones. The spread through the Americas may have involved a combination of coastal travel, inland river movement, and regional exploration over many generations. A family might follow the sea for part of the year, move inland for stone or game, travel along rivers, and return to familiar coastal camps. Later archaeologists, finding only scattered stone tools and faint hearths, would turn those lives into migration models. But the people themselves lived in seasons, not arrows. The question of route matters because it shapes the mystery of disappearance. If early populations moved along coasts now drowned, many of their traces may be gone from ordinary view. If others travelled through interior corridors only later, their evidence may appear younger and more visible. This can make later movements look like beginnings, and earlier movements look like ghosts. It can also create the illusion of replacement, where there may have been continuity hidden underwater or masked by changing technologies. No single explanation fully accounts for the scattered evidence, because the geography of evidence itself has changed. The first Americans moved through a continent still being born from ice. Their paths were not fixed roads, but openings in weather, water, animals, and memory. Some routes may have been walked, some may have been paddled, some may have vanished within a lifetime as shorelines shifted and glacial lakes burst. The old question asked which route they took, as if there had to be one. The deeper answer may be that they took the routes the world allowed, and the world did not allow the same thing everywhere at the same time. Somewhere beneath the modern Pacific, beyond the reach of ordinary excavation, there may still be camps where fires once burned beside a colder sea. Somewhere under the interior plains, later paths may cover earlier ones. The trail south is real, but it is broken, and its brokenness is part of the story. The deeper one follows the trail of the first Americans. The more the landscape itself begins to feel like an unreliable witness. It has seen everything, held everything for a moment, and then quietly destroyed most of what it knew. A camp beside a river can be cut away by the same river 1,000 years later. A shoreline rich with shells, fish bones, hearths, and tools can vanish under the rising sea. A dry cave can collapse. A wetland can preserve a footprint for 20,000 years, while a nearby village of shelters, baskets, wooden stakes, and sleeping places disappears without leaving a stain. The mystery is not only that evidence is rare, it is that evidence survives according to rules that have very little to do with the importance of the lives being lived. This is one of the hardest truths in early American archaeology. The first people in the hemisphere may have been everywhere the evidence is not, along old coasts now drowned, beside rivers that shifted course, on exposed plains later buried by sediment, in forest camps where acidic soils dissolved bone, on ice margin landscapes scraped, flooded, and rearranged. The archaeological record can feel like a map of human behaviour, but it is also a map of preservation. It tells us where stone lasted, where bone mineralized, where peat sealed organic remains, where caves protected sediment, where deserts dried objects before decay could finish its work. It also hides places where people may have lived for generations, simply because the materials, soils, and later geological events refuse to keep their traces. The lost coastlines may be the greatest absence of all. During the late Ice Age, sea levels were much lower than they are today, exposing broad continental shelves along parts of the Americas. What is now underwater may once have been dry land, estuary, river mouth, marsh, beach, island chain, or sheltered bay. These are exactly the kinds of places that mobile foragers often find useful. They offer food from land and sea, fresh water, travel routes, birds, shellfish, fish runs, marine mammals, driftwood, edible plants, and stone in some regions. If early groups moved along the Pacific edge, many of their most important camps would not be near the modern shore. They would be offshore, beneath cold water, sand, silt, and kelp. This creates a strange imbalance. Inland sites are easier to find because they remain on land. But if the earliest migration was heavily coastal, then inland evidence may represent only part of the story, perhaps even a later part. The places that could explain the earliest movement may be among the hardest to reach. Underwater archaeology is possible, but it is expensive, difficult, and dependent on knowing where to look in landscapes that have been transformed since the Pleistocene. Ancient river channels can be mapped, submerged terraces can be studied, stone tools can sometimes survive beneath the sea, but finding a small camp used by a few families more than 14,000 years ago under marine sediment is not like finding a shipwreck. There may be no large structure, no metal, no obvious outline, no clear signal. The evidence remains incomplete not because the search is careless, but because the archive itself is buried under an ocean. Rivers also erase as much as they preserve. Early people would have been drawn to river valleys for obvious reasons. Water attracts animals, supports plants, exposes stone, and offers movement through terrain. Yet rivers are restless. They migrate sideways across floodplains, cut down through older deposits, bury surfaces under new sediment, and destroy the very camps they once nourished. A hearth built on a river terrace can survive if the terrace is abandoned and sealed. It can also vanish if the river returns. A butchered bone can be carried away. A scatter of flakes can be spread, rolled, and mixed with natural stones. Later people may occupy the same attractive spot again and again, disturbing earlier traces without knowing they are doing so. In such places, the problem is not a lack of human activity. It may be too much activity, layered through time until the earlier signal becomes faint. Glaciers are even less forgiving. In the north, ice did not merely cover land, it crushed, scraped, transported, and remade it. Entire earlier surfaces were removed, valleys were deepened, rocks were dragged across bedrock, sediments were ground and redeposited, meltwater floods rearranged plains and carved channels. If people lived near ice margins, some of their traces may have been obliterated outright. If they waited in unglaciated refuges, their sites may be deeply buried or scattered across landscapes later changed by permafrost, erosion, and thaw. The first American record is therefore shaped by a paradox. People may have lived close to the very forces most capable of destroying the evidence of their lives. Even when artifacts survive, recognizing them can be difficult. A Clovis point declares itself. A beautifully shaped biface or a fluted projectile point is hard to ignore. But a simple flake tool, a battered cobble, a worked bone, or a stone broken in a way that resembles natural fracture can lead to years of disagreement. At very old sites, archaeologists must ask whether stones were deliberately shaped, whether bones were cut by tools or broken by animals, whether charcoal belongs to a human fire or a natural burn, whether objects stayed in their original layer, and whether dates truly measure the occupation being studied. Scholars still debate some early claims because the boundary between human signal and natural process can be thin. The older the evidence, the more time there has been for confusion to enter the ground. There is also the problem of what early people chose to make. Stone dominates archaeology not because ancient lives were made mostly of stone, but because stone survives. A mobile group might carry baskets, nets, cords, hide bags, wooden digging sticks, bone awls, hafted tools, resin adhesives, sleeping mats, and clothing stitched or tied with perishable fibre. They may have used boats or rafts, traps, snares, and containers. These objects could be central to survival and almost invisible after thousands of years. Monte Verde is so valuable precisely because it preserved some of this softer world. It reminds us that a camp made mostly of organic materials can look rich when preservation is kind, and nearly absent when preservation is ordinary. A lesser-known complication is that the first Americans may have left evidence in forms archaeologists were not initially trained to prioritize: ancient footprints, microscopic plant residues, DNA in sediment, proteins, starch grains, use wear on tools, and chemical traces of hearths can reveal activity that is not obvious to the naked eye. These methods are transforming the field, but they also require caution. A footprint must be dated correctly. A residue must be securely linked to human use. Environmental DNA can move or degrade. Microscopic evidence can be powerful, yet it rarely removes every uncertainty. It adds new voices to the record, but those voices still need context. This makes the idea of disappearance especially slippery. When a tool tradition disappears, did the people vanish, or did they change what they made? When a site type disappears, did a population collapse, or did it move to places that no longer preserve evidence? When early genetic lineages become hard to detect, were people replaced, absorbed, reduced by bottlenecks, or simply unsampled by the ancient DNA available so far? No single explanation fully accounts for this, because disappearance can happen in the ground long before it happens in life. Archaeology often sees the end of a pattern, not necessarily the end of a people. The continent itself has edited the story. It has drowned coastlines, broken riverbanks, sealed caves, scattered bones, buried camps, and kept a few impossible gifts: a footprint in gypsum-rich sediment, a hearth in a protected layer, a mastodon bone with a human mark, a tool beneath another tool, a trace of DNA in ancient remains. From these fragments, researchers build models, revise them, argue over them, and sometimes surrender old certainties. The first Americans did not leave a continuous road of evidence behind them. They left sparks across a dark field, and time has blown out many of them. What remains is enough to show movement, skill, adaptation, and deep presence, but not enough to make the path simple. That is why the mystery persists. The people were real. The continent was real. The loss is also real, and much of it happened before anyone began to ask what had been lost. For generations, the search for the first Americans depended on the things people dropped, shaped, burned, buried, or stepped into: stone points, flakes, bones, hearths, footprints, house floors, plant remains, and sediments form the language of the field. Archaeologists read that language carefully, but it was always a language with missing words, A tool could show that people were present, but not always who they were related to. A campsite could reveal behavior, but not ancestry. A burial could hold a body, but without living descendants or recoverable genetic material, even the body might remain strangely silent. Then ancient DNA began to turn that silence into something else. Not a complete answer, not a final map, but a new kind of evidence capable of reaching into questions that stone alone could not touch. The power of DNA is that it carries history inside the body. It does not replace archaeology, and it cannot tell a whole human story by itself, but it can reveal relationships across time with startling precision. A child buried thousands of years ago can show connections to people living far away. A fragment of bone can reveal whether a population belongs near the root of later indigenous lineages or to a branch that left fewer descendants. A genome can show mixture, separation, bottlenecks, and movement that would be invisible in tools. Once researchers began recovering ancient genomes from the Americas and from Northeast Asia, the old image of a single simple migration began to dissolve even further. One of the most important early revelations came from the remains of a child associated with Clovis artifacts in Montana, often known as the Anzic child. The burial was around 12,600 years old, close to the famous Clovis horizon, and the genome showed a strong relationship to later indigenous peoples of the Americas, especially groups from Central and South America. This mattered because it tied Clovis, at least in this case, to Native American ancestry rather than to some separate vanished population unrelated to later peoples. It did not mean all early populations were identical, and it did not solve every question. But it made one thing difficult to deny: the makers or users of Clovis technology were part of the deeper ancestry of indigenous America. That finding changed the tone of an older debate. Some earlier interpretations had treated ancient remains in the Americas as if they might represent mysterious outsiders, people somehow disconnected from Native American histories. Ancient DNA has repeatedly made that kind of separation harder to sustain. Again and again, very old remains in the Americas show relationships, sometimes close and sometimes more distant, to indigenous peoples rather than to imagined lost races. This does not flatten the complexity of the past. It deepens it. It suggests that the earliest story is not one of a people arriving and then being entirely erased by unrelated newcomers. It is a story of branching, movement, regional change, and survival through transformation. Another powerful genome came from a child in Alaska, from the Upward Sun River site, dating to around 11,500 years ago. This child belonged to a population often described as ancient Beringian, a lineage related to but distinct from the ancestors of later northern and southern Native American branches. The discovery gave genetic weight to the idea that Beringia was not simply a corridor, but a place where populations could remain separated and develop their own histories. The ancient Beringian lineage appears to have split early from the ancestors of many later Native Americans, and although it did not continue as a major separate ancestry in the same visible way, it shows that the far north held complexity that archaeology alone had not fully resolved. A population can be real, deeply rooted, and then leave only faint traces in later genomes. This is where genetics begins to rewrite movement not as a single arrow, but as a tree whose branches grow, split, overlap, and sometimes disappear into one another. Many studies point to an ancestral population with roots in Northeast Asia that became genetically distinct before or during the time people moved into the Americas. From that ancestry came major branches often described broadly as Northern and Southern Native American lineages, though those labels simplify a much more detailed reality. The southern branch seems to have expanded widely and rapidly into much of the hemisphere, reaching deep South America early. The northern branch contributed strongly to many peoples in northern North America. But these were not sealed categories. Over thousands of years, populations moved, mixed, replaced one another in some regions, persisted in others, and carried older ancestry into new forms. The speed implied by genetic evidence is one of its most striking features. Ancient genomes from North and South America suggest that by around 13,000 to 12,000 years ago, populations ancestral to later indigenous peoples had already spread across vast distances. This fits the archaeological pressure created by Monte Verde and other early sites. If people were in South America early, then the genetic branches leading to later regional populations must also have been forming and moving quickly. The Americas were not peopled slowly in a single front that took many thousands of years to crawl southward. Instead, once viable routes opened, human expansion may have been swift, carried by small mobile groups who knew how to exploit rivers, coasts, grasslands, and forests. Yet DNA also warns against imagining that speed is simplicity. A rapid expansion can carry within it older pauses. A group may spend thousands of years separated in Beringia, then spread widely in a few centuries. A small founding population can give rise to enormous diversity later. A bottleneck can make many descendants look closely related even if their cultures become richly different. The evidence remains incomplete because ancient genomes are still rare compared with the size of the continents and the length of the time span. Warm climates often destroy DNA. Many regions are underrepresented. Ethical concerns, indigenous sovereignty, and the treatment of ancestral remains rightly shape what research can and should be done. Science here does not operate in empty space. It touches living communities. There is a lesser-known kind of disappearance hidden inside genetic evidence. Sometimes a population can be discovered only because it left a trace in another population. It may not have a clear archaeological culture named after it. It may not have a famous toolkit. It may not have a burial ground that researchers can identify as uniquely its own. Instead, it appears as an ancestry component, a branching pattern, a signal of mixture. Geneticists sometimes speak of ghost populations, not because they were supernatural or mythical, but because they are inferred from traces left in the genomes of others. The first American story includes such ghosts. Some may represent real groups that lived, moved, married, fought, adapted, and died, yet survive scientifically as patterns rather than as named peoples. Ancient DNA has also revealed later migrations that complicate the phrase the first Americans. The peoples of the Arctic, for example, have their own deep and dynamic history, including Paleo-Eskimo movements and later expansions connected to the ancestors of Inuit and related groups. In parts of North America, ancestry associated with later movements from Siberia contributed to some indigenous populations, especially in the far north and among Nadine-speaking groups. Though the exact histories are complex and still debated, these later migrations do not replace the earliest founding story, they layer onto it. The Americas were not entered once and then closed. The North remained a zone of movement, contact, and change long after the first expansion. Genetics also creates uncomfortable but necessary humility. It can reveal that two skeletons with similar skull shapes are not closely related in the way once assumed. It can show that tool traditions do not map perfectly onto biological ancestry. It can demonstrate continuity where archaeologists expected replacement, or mixture where older narratives imagined isolation. But it cannot tell us what language people spoke, what songs they sang, what spirits they honoured. What names they gave to rivers, or how they understood the lands they crossed. DNA is powerful because it is intimate, but it is also narrow. It follows inheritance, not the whole of life. The mystery of why the first Americans disappeared therefore becomes more subtle under the light of genetics. Some did not disappear at all. Their ancestry continues in living peoples. Some early branches may have faded as separate populations while contributing to others. Some may have been lost through demographic bottlenecks, disease, conflict, climate stress, or simple absorption into larger communities. Some remain unsampled. Their histories waiting in places where DNA has not survived or has not been studied. What survives in the record suggests that disappearance was rarely a clean ending. It was more often a change in visibility. The old stones still matter, the footprints still matter, the drowned coasts still matter, but ancient DNA has added a second landscape beneath the first, a landscape of descent and relation running through bone and blood. It shows a peopling of the Americas that is ancient, rapid, structured, and deeply connected to the present. It does not close the mystery. It makes the mystery more precise. The first Americans were not a single shadow passing briefly across a continent. They were ancestors. Branches, lost lines, surviving lines, and living legacies, moving through a world where the ice was retreating and the future of half the planet was beginning to take human form. Once the genetic branches begin to spread and the archaeological traces scatter across the map, the first Americans become easier to see in one sense and harder to imagine in another. They are no longer just points on a timeline or arrows moving out of Beringia. They are people entering specific landscapes, each one demanding a different kind of intelligence. A family moving along a northern coast does not live the same way as a group crossing an inland grassland. People near a river mouth do not solve the same daily problems as people following herds across dry plains, or gathering plants in a forest, or watching the edge of a desert for seasonal water. The peopling of the Americas was not one act of arrival. It was thousands of acts of adjustment, repeated across a continent that refused to stay still. The late Pleistocene Americas were alive with abundance, but not with ease. Huge animals moved through many regions, mammoths with curved tusks, mastodons browsing in woodlands, ancient bison, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and other creatures now gone. To modernize, such a world can look like a hunter's dream, but large animals are not simply food waiting to be taken. They are dangerous, mobile, unpredictable, and often difficult to kill. A mammoth is not defeated by courage alone. It requires planning, knowledge of terrain, cooperation, weapons that work, and a willingness to risk injury in a world without hospitals. Even scavenging from a carcass could bring conflict with predators whose power is difficult to exaggerate. The first peoples of the Americas were not walking through a peaceful park of giant beasts. They were entering an ecosystem where every meal carried calculation. Yet it would be a mistake to reduce them to mammoth hunters. That image has lasted partly because mammoth bones preserve well, and dramatic kill sites seize the imagination. What survives in the record suggests a much broader set of lifeways. Early people likely hunted large and small animals, trapped or collected smaller creatures, gathered seeds, roots, fruits, nuts, and greens where available, fished rivers and lakes, harvested shellfish along coasts, took birds and eggs, used hides for shelter and clothing, and turned bone, antler, wood, sinew, fibre, and stone into tools. Their world was not divided into nature and culture in the way modern language often divides it. The landscape was a storehouse, a danger, a memory field, and a map of obligations all at once. Seasonality would have shaped nearly everything. In colder regions, winter demanded stored knowledge as much as stored food. People had to know which valleys held shelter from wind, where animals moved when snow changed the ground, where dry wood could be found, how to protect infants, how to keep fire alive, how to repair clothing, and how to avoid wasting energy when energy itself was survival. In warmer regions, the problem might be heat, water, insects, dense vegetation, or the timing of plant foods. In deserts and dry basins, a water source could mean life for a few days and then nothing. In forests, visibility was limited and movement was slower, but plants and animals offered different rewards. The Americas did not present one frontier. They presented hundreds. This is why the earliest expansion seems so remarkable. Human beings coming from Northeast Asia and Beringia already carried deep traditions of adaptation, but the Americas forced those traditions into new combinations. Every unfamiliar plant had to be tested carefully, or learned through observation. Every animal had to be understood through tracks, droppings, calls, seasonal movement, and behavior under pressure. Every stone source had to be found and remembered. A group that moved too quickly without learning could starve in a rich landscape simply because richness is not the same as knowledge. The people who survived were those who turned unknown country into known country. One river bend, one valley, one shoreline, and one season at a time. Their technology was likely more varied than the surviving stone record shows. Stone points and blades matter, but they were only parts of larger systems. A projectile point without a shaft, binding, adhesive, and practice throw or thrust is only a shaped rock. A scraper matters because hides matter. A blade matters because meat, wood, bone, fibre, and plant stems must be cut. A hearth matters because heat transforms food, makes some plants safer, deters predators, hardens materials, creates light, preserves social time, and becomes the centre of camp life. A small flake found in the ground may once have been part of a whole evening of work repairing a weapon, cutting sinew, scraping fat from a hide, preparing a child's clothing against cold weather. Archaeology finds the flake. The life around it must be reconstructed with care. There is a lesser-known intimacy in the earliest evidence that often gets overshadowed by migration models. Footprints at some ancient sites suggest children and adolescents moving alongside adults, not as decorative details but as members of working communities. Children in hunter-gatherer worlds learn by watching, following, imitating, gathering, carrying, playing near work, and gradually taking on skill. A small footprint near larger ones can imply movement with family, perhaps during a task, perhaps across a wet surface that no one expected to preserve them. The first Americans were not only bands of adult hunters with spear points, they were infants carried against the body, elders with memory of places, young people learning routes, and families negotiating the ordinary difficulty of staying alive. The social world matters because small populations are fragile. A group can know the land brilliantly and still be vulnerable to injury, hunger, conflict, childbirth complications, bad weather, or the loss of key knowledge holders. Moving through new country may require maintaining relationships across distance. People may have exchanged stone, mates, stories, techniques, and information about resources. Archaeological finds of non-local materials suggest that some early groups either travelled widely or belonged to networks through which objects moved. A stone from far away is never just a stone. It can mean mobility, memory, trade, alliance, or repeated seasonal return. The evidence remains incomplete, but even scattered materials hint that early America was not a silent emptiness dotted with isolated camps. It was becoming a web of human knowledge. Regional differences would have appeared quickly. Along the Pacific coast, people could rely on marine foods where conditions allowed, reading tides and currents, gathering shellfish, watching bird colonies, and using boats or rafts if they had them. In the Great Basin and interior West, mobility may have followed water, game, and seasonal plants across open country. On the Great Plains, large herd animals shaped movement and opportunity, but so did rivers, stone sources, and shelter from weather. In eastern woodlands, mastodons, deer, fish, nuts, and wetland resources may have formed different patterns of life. In Central and South America, people encountered tropics, mountains, savannas, highlands, rainforests, and long coastlines with astonishing speed. The idea of one first American lifestyle dissolves almost as soon as people spread. And still, beneath all that diversity, there were shared human needs. Fire had to be made or carried, food had to be found, children had to be protected, tools had to be repaired, dead people had to be treated in ways that mattered to the living, weather had to be endured, the unknown had to be turned into memory. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly these early populations adapted, but the answer likely lies in flexibility rather than specialization. They were not successful because they had one perfect strategy. They were successful because they could change strategies. In that sense, the first peoples take shape not as a vanished race or a single culture, but as communities of movement and attention. They follow animals, but they also follow ripening plants, safe crossings, stone outcrops, coastlines, stories, and kin. They live in landscapes still haunted by ice, but also warmed by fires and marked by repeated return. They face animals now extinct and climates now gone, but their problems are recognizably human hunger, danger, memory, birth, loss, cooperation, and the need to make tomorrow possible. The mystery of their disappearance cannot be understood until their presence is imagined fully. They were not shadows at the edge of archaeology. They were people making homes out of change. Around the same broad span of time that the first peoples are spreading through the Americas, the animal world begins to change in a way so large that it almost defies imagination. The continent they enter is not the continent known today. It is heavier with life, crowded with bodies that seem half familiar and half mythic. Mammoths move across open ground with tusks like curved branches of ivory. Mastodons browse in forests and wetlands. Ancient horses run where no wild horses will remain. Camels, born of North American evolution long before their later relatives crossed deserts elsewhere, still walk the western landscapes. Giant ground sloths rise like living towers near trees and riverbanks. Saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, and other predators turn the same country into a place of constant tension. Then, within a few thousand years near the end of the Pleistocene, many of these animals disappear. Their disappearance hangs over the story of the first Americans like a shadow, because it happens close enough in time to human arrival that the connection is impossible to ignore, yet complicated enough that no simple accusation can bear the whole weight. For a long time, one powerful explanation imagined newly arrived hunters sweeping through a continent of animals that had never learned to fear humans. In this view, people armed with efficient weapons and cooperative strategies moved rapidly from north to south, killing mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, and other large species faster than those animals could reproduce or adapt. The idea has a grim elegance. It explains the timing. It gives humans a central role. It fits some dramatic kill sites where stone tools and extinct animal bones appear together, but the evidence remains incomplete. And the real pattern is less clean than the image of a continent-wide hunting wave. The first problem is that not all extinct animals show direct evidence of human hunting. Mammoth and mastodon kill or butchery sites are real and important, especially in North America, but they are relatively rare when compared with the scale of the extinction. Many species vanished without clear archaeological scenes showing people killing them. That does not prove humans were uninvolved. Hunting can leave little evidence, and scavenged or processed carcasses may not preserve well. But it does mean the old image of people personally slaughtering every doomed species is too simple. Some animals may have been hunted directly. Others may have suffered from habitat loss, climate stress, disrupted reproduction, competition, fire, disease, or cascading ecological changes in which human pressure was only one part. The climate at the end of the Ice Age was not gentle. It shifted sharply, sometimes within a human lifetime. Warming trends altered vegetation. Glaciers retreated. Sea levels rose. Wetlands expanded in some regions and vanished in others. Grasslands changed into forests. Forests opened into parklands, and water sources moved or dried. Then came sudden reversals and cold pulses, including the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that began around 12,900 years ago and lasted for more than 1,000 years. Scholars still debate how different regions experienced these changes, but for large animals dependent on particular habitats, migration routes, and food systems, such instability could be devastating. A mammoth does not need the entire continent to become unlivable. It needs enough of its calving grounds, grazing areas, water sources, and movement corridors to fail at once. Large animals are especially vulnerable because they reproduce slowly. A mouse population can rebound quickly after a bad season. Mammoths cannot. If adults are lost faster than calves mature, even a small additional pressure can push a stressed population toward collapse. Human hunting, in this sense, does not need to be spectacular to matter. People may have killed only a limited number of animals, but if those animals were already under climate stress, the effect could be disproportionate. This is sometimes called an overkill or blitzkrieg model in its strongest form, but many researchers now favour more blended explanations, where human predation interacts with environmental change. No single explanation fully accounts for all the extinctions across both continents, because the timing species affected and regional conditions vary. There is a strange irony here. The first Americans were themselves adapting to a world in upheaval. They were not outside nature, standing apart as a destructive force with modern distance. They were small, mobile communities trying to survive through the same unstable climate that pressured the animals around them. They watched herds shift, water change, forests move, storms alter familiar places, and perhaps animals become scarce in regions where older people remembered them as common. If people contributed to extinctions, they may not have understood the process as extinction at all. They would have known absence locally fewer tracks in a valley, fewer animals returning in a season, longer searches, old hunting places failing. The end of a species becomes visible only from a great distance. Up close, it arrives as hunger, uncertainty, and changing routes. The disappearance of megafauna would have changed human life profoundly. Large animals were not only meat, they were hides, bones, sinew, fat, tools, fuel in treeless regions, raw material, and possibly spiritual presence. A mammoth kill could feed many people and provide materials for shelter and equipment. Mastodon bones and tusks could enter technologies and meanings that archaeology can only partly recover. When those animals vanished, people had to adjust. They turned more heavily toward bison, deer, smaller mammals, fish, birds, plants, nuts, seeds, shellfish, and regional resources. Tool traditions changed, mobility patterns shifted, camps moved, social networks may have reoriented around different seasonal cycles. In this sense, the megafaunal extinction is not just an animal story, it is a human turning point. This may help explain why some early archaeological patterns seem to fade. If a way of life is tied to open landscapes and large Ice Age animals, then the loss of those animals and the transformation of those landscapes can make the people associated with them appear to disappear, but they may not vanish biologically. Their descendants may change tools, diets, territories, and identities. A culture built around one set of animals can become something else when those animals are gone. Archaeology might see the end of Clovis-style big game associations and mistake it for the end of a people, when it may represent adaptation under pressure. Disappearance, again, can be a change in visibility. There are also ecological consequences that would have reshaped the land itself. Large herbivores are not passive occupants of an environment. They break branches, spread seeds, disturb soils, maintain open spaces, create trails, fertilize ground, and influence plant communities through grazing and browsing. When mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, and giant sloths vanish, the vegetation changes not only because climate changes, but because animal engineering disappears. Forests and grasslands reorganize. Fire regimes may shift. Some plants lose major seed dispersers. Predators lose prey and vanish in turn. The first Americans lived through not merely the loss of animals, but the reworking of whole ecosystems. One lesser-known detail is that extinctions were not identical everywhere. South America lost its own extraordinary animals, including giant ground sloths, glyptodonts with armoured bodies like living fortresses, native horses, and strange hoofed mammals unlike anything alive today. The timing and causes remain debated, and in some places human arrival, climate change, and ecological vulnerability overlap in ways that are difficult to separate. The Americas were vast. An extinction unfolded unevenly across them. That unevenness is part of why confident, continent-wide explanations often fail. What was true on a North American plain may not have been true in a South American forest, a Patagonian steppe, or a tropical wetland. The megafauna shadow deepens the central mystery because it ties human arrival to loss without reducing ancient people to villains or bystanders. They were participants in changing ecosystems, sometimes hunters, sometimes scavengers, sometimes observers, sometimes victims of scarcity, always adapting. The animals disappeared, and with them disappeared whole ways of knowing the land. Tracks once read daily became memories. Hunting skills once vital became less useful. Stories attached to enormous animals may have survived in forms archaeology cannot securely trace, but the living bodies were gone. By the time later generations inherited the continent, the old Ice Age world had already closed behind them, and so the question of why the first Americans disappeared cannot be separated from the question of why their world disappeared. The people did not move through a stable stage. The stage itself collapsed, flooded, warmed, cooled, dried, and regrew around them. Mammoths and mastodons vanished. coastlines drowned, ice corridors opened, forests advanced, grasslands retreated. Human communities endured by changing, but change can make ancestors difficult to recognize. The first Americans were not erased in a single catastrophe. They lived through a cascade of endings, and one of the greatest was the silence left where the giant animals had been. When the giant animals fade from the record and the Clovis horizon changes into something more regional, more varied, and less instantly recognizable, it can look at first as if the first Americans themselves have vanished. The sharp signature that once made them so visible begins to dissolve. Fluted points become less common. New tool forms appear. Hunting strategies shift. Camps look different. The dramatic association with mammoths and mastodons weakens, because the animals themselves are gone or nearly gone. From a great distance, the pattern resembles disappearance. A people arrive, spread, leave a dazzling stone technology, witness the end of an Ice Age world, and then slip into the dark. But deep history often plays tricks with visibility. What looks like disappearance in one kind of evidence may be transformation in another. This is the heart of the mystery. Were some of the earliest populations in the Americas truly lost, leaving no living descendants or only faint traces, or did they become ancestors of later indigenous peoples while changing so thoroughly that archaeologists stopped recognizing them as the same communities? The answer is probably not one thing. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, because the Americas were too vast, the populations too mobile, and the record too damaged. In some places, people may have died out locally. In others, they may have moved away, elsewhere. They may have merged with neighboring groups, adopted new technologies, changed diets, shifted territories, and continued under forms that no longer looked like the earliest archaeological patterns. A tool tradition is not a people. This seems obvious, but for a long time archaeology had to lean heavily on tools because tools were what survived. If a distinctive point style appeared, spread, and then vanished, it was tempting to imagine a matching people appearing, spreading, and vanishing with it. Yet technologies can move between groups. They can be copied, modified, abandoned, or replaced without the population itself disappearing. A community that once made fluted points might stop making them because the prey changed, the hunting method changed, the available stone changed, or social traditions shifted. Their grandchildren might carry the same ancestry and live in the same broad region while using tools that archaeologists classify under a different name. The stone changes, the people continue. Ancient DNA has made this distinction impossible to ignore. Some early genomes show clear relationships to later indigenous peoples, which means that at least some of the people living near the end of the Pleistocene did not vanish in a total biological sense. Their descendants survived, diversified, and became part of the living ancestry of the Americas. But DNA also reveals early branches that seem to narrow, blend, or disappear as distinct lineages. The ancient Beringian signal, for example, points to a population that was real and deeply important, yet not visible today as a large separate branch in the same way as other Native American ancestries. That does not mean those people evaporated. It may mean they were absorbed, reduced, replaced in certain regions, or simply carried forward in ways that later sampling only partly detects. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because ancient genomes are still rare and unevenly distributed. There is a human reality behind those abstract genetic terms. Absorption is not a cold event. It can mean marriages, adoptions, alliances, children raised between groups, survivors joining neighboring communities after hardship, or families moving into a new region and becoming part of an existing network. Replacement is not always a sudden conquest. It can happen through generations of unequal population growth, changing environments, or the success of one settlement pattern over another. Local extinction can happen quietly, through hunger, disease, injury, conflict, isolation, or repeated bad seasons. A small group at the edge of a range might vanish without leaving signs dramatic enough to be recognized. In deep time, entire communities can disappear from the record with less visible disturbance than a single later village fire. The end of the Pleistocene would have increased these pressures. As climates shifted and animal communities reorganized, groups whose knowledge was tuned to one world had to adjust to another. Open grasslands might become shrubland or forest. A river crossing might flood. A reliable herd might no longer pass through. A coastline might move year by year as the sea rose. Food systems changed, and with them changed the social maps built around those foods. A group that once met others at a seasonal hunting place might lose that gathering point when the animals disappeared. Exchange networks could weaken. Marriage partners could become harder to find. Information about distant resources might stop flowing. For small populations, social isolation can be as dangerous as hunger. This may be one way early peoples disappeared, not through a single catastrophe, but through the breaking of connections. Hunter-gatherer communities often depend on networks beyond the immediate camp. Kinship ties, exchange, shared rituals, and seasonal meetings help buffer risk. When one region fails, people can move toward relatives or allies elsewhere. When a tool material is scarce, exchange can bring it from a distance. When a group loses members, marriage networks can restore balance. But if climate instability, rising seas, shifting animal ranges, and population movement disrupt those connections, small communities become more vulnerable. The archaeological record may show only a change in artifacts, while underneath that change lies a social world being rearranged. Another possibility is that some early populations were never very numerous. A small founding population can spread widely, and still remain demographically fragile for a long time. Expansion does not always mean abundance. A few groups moving quickly along coasts and rivers might cover enormous distances without filling the land densely. Their archaeological footprint would be light, and their survival would depend on maintaining enough people across enough connected groups. If some of those early branches failed, the loss might leave only faint genetic hints, or none at all if later populations expanded over the same territories. Scholars still debate how many movements entered the Americas, how many early lineages survived, and how much diversity may have been lost before the surviving genetic record becomes visible. South America sharpens the puzzle. Ancient DNA suggests that people spread there early and rapidly, yet some early genetic patterns do not map neatly onto later populations. There are hints of population turnovers in certain regions, continuity in others, and deep ancestry that survives unevenly. Archaeology shows early adaptation to coasts, highlands, forests, and open plains, but connecting each site to a specific biological lineage is usually impossible. A camp in Chile, a skeleton in Brazil. Tools in the Andes, footprints in North America, and genomes from scattered burials are all parts of the same vast story, but they do not form a simple family photograph. They are more like pieces of a mural recovered from different walls after an earthquake. The idea of disappearance also depends on the scale being used. At the scale of a single campsite, people disappear every time they move. At the scale of a tool tradition, people disappear when they change what they make. At the scale of a genetic lineage, People disappear when their ancestry becomes diluted, unsampled, or absorbed into others. At the scale of living nations and communities, disappearance can be a dangerous word because it may erase continuity, sovereignty, and memory. The first Americans are not a vanished species. They are part of the ancestry of living indigenous peoples, even though some early branches and lifeways are lost beyond recovery. The language must be careful because the stakes are not only scientific, they are human. What merges is not a clean replacement story, and not a simple survival story either. It is a transformation story with losses inside it. The earliest peoples entered a continent in upheaval, adapted with extraordinary speed, and then faced the collapse of the Ice Age ecosystems that had shaped their first expansions. Some communities likely failed, some merged, some moved, some changed beyond archaeological recognition. Their descendants carried pieces of them forward: genes, technologies, habits of landscape knowledge, perhaps stories whose deep origins cannot be securely traced. The first Americans disappeared only if one expects them to remain frozen in their first visible form. But no people does that. Survival itself is a kind of vanishing, because to live through a changing world is to become something else. Far to the north, where the continent narrows back toward Asia and the sea remembers the drowned land of Beringia, another mystery takes shape. It is quieter than the question of Clovis, less dramatic than mammoth bones or ancient footprints, but it reaches deeply into the problem of disappearance. Archaeology in the Arctic has often shown cultures arriving, spreading, changing, and then vanishing from the visible record. Toolkits appear in cold landscapes, camps dot the coasts and tundra, houses take shape in stone, bone, turf, or snow-shadowed ground, and then the pattern changes. A people known through their artifacts seem to fade, replaced by another way of life, another technology, another rhythm of survival. For a long time, such changes could look like endings. But ancient DNA has made the Arctic one of the clearest places where disappearance and survival refuse to mean the same thing. The Arctic is a hard archive. Cold can preserve, but it can also scatter. Wind scours surfaces, permafrost heaves and cracks, coasts erode with frightening speed as ice, storms, and waves attack the edges of the land. Camps built from organic materials may survive in extraordinary condition in one place and vanish completely in another. The people who lived there had to master a world that offered abundance only to those who understood its rules. Sea mammals, fish, caribou, birds, driftwood, stone, bone, ivory, skins, and seasonal movement all mattered. A mistake in timing could be fatal, a missed migration, a broken tool, a storm at the wrong moment, or thin ice underfoot could turn knowledge into survival or absence. The earliest founding populations of the Americas were not the last to move through this northern gate. Long after the first expansion southward, the Arctic remained connected to Siberia in ways that more southern regions were not. Across the Bering Strait and the high-latitude coasts, people continued to move, meet, separate, and adapt. Later migrations brought new technologies and new ancestries into the far north. Among the most important were the Paleo-Arctic and later Paleo-Eskimo traditions, followed much later by the Thule expansion, ancestral in important ways to Inuit and related peoples. The details are complex, and scholars still debate many aspects of timing and interaction. But one broad point is clear: the Arctic was not a frozen dead end. It was a corridor, a homeland, and a contact zone. The Paleo-Eskimo story is especially revealing because, in archaeology, It once looked like a dramatic disappearance. People associated with early Arctic traditions spread across vast northern regions, from Alaska through the Canadian Arctic and into Greenland. They carried specialized tools for life in extreme conditions. They hunted, traveled, made camps, and learned landscapes where winter could dominate the imagination. Later, their archaeological traces gave way to other traditions, and in some places it seemed as if they had vanished entirely before the arrival or expansion of later Arctic peoples. For decades, the question hovered, were they replaced, absorbed, or extinguished by climate, isolation, competition, or demographic fragility? Ancient DNA complicated the answer. Genetic studies suggested that Paleo-Eskimo groups were distinct from both earlier Native American founding populations and later Inuit-related populations. In some interpretations, they contributed little ancestry to many later Arctic peoples, which seemed to support a picture of replacement. Yet newer and broader genetic work has also revealed that the story is not simply one of total erasure everywhere. Traces of ancient Arctic-related ancestry can survive in later populations in unexpected ways, especially where sampling improves and the relationships between ancient groups become clearer. The evidence remains incomplete, but it shows that even in a region where archaeology seems to mark a disappearance, bloodlines and ancestry may tell a more layered story. This is why the phrase ghosts in living blood is so useful, if handled carefully. These are not ghosts in the supernatural sense. They are ancestral signals, faint but real, carried through generations after the visible culture associated with them has changed or vanished. A group can cease to exist as a named archaeological tradition, while some of its descendants live on through mixture with others. People marry across boundaries. Children inherit ancestry from several communities. Survivors of a declining group may join neighbors. A technology may disappear while families continue. In the Arctic, where populations were often small and survival required networks of cooperation, the line between replacement and absorption could be thin, shifting, and deeply human. The Arctic also shows how environment can amplify disappearance. Small populations living at the edge of ecological possibility are vulnerable to climate swings. A warming period can change sea ice and animal routes. A cooling period can shorten seasons and increase hunger. Marine mammals may shift their ranges. Caribou herds may alter migration paths. Storms may become more dangerous. Driftwood, essential in treeless regions, may become scarce or arrive unpredictably. When a culture depends on specialized knowledge of ice, animals, and seasons, environmental change does not merely alter the background. It attacks the structure of life itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of early Arctic traditions, but climate pressure almost certainly formed part of the danger. At the same time, the Arctic warns against imagining ancient populations as helpless victims of weather. These were highly skilled people. Their toolkits show ingenuity, precision, and deep familiarity with materials such as bone, antler, ivory, stone, and hide. Their survival required planning over long cycles, not just day-to-day reaction. They knew how to move through cold, how to store food, how to read animal behavior, how to build shelter, how to travel across snow and water, and how to transform scarce materials into life-saving equipment. If some Arctic groups disappeared as distinct traditions, it was not because they lacked intelligence or resilience. It is because even resilient systems can be overwhelmed when population size, climate stress, isolation, and competition converge. There is a subtle connection here to the earliest Americans farther south. The founding populations who entered the hemisphere also passed through northern pressures. perhaps pausing in Beringia and expanding when routes opened. Later Arctic histories replay, in a different key, the same themes movement from Asia: adaptation to harsh environments, small populations, changing climates, visible archaeological traditions that do not always match genetic survival. The North becomes a mirror for the whole American story. It shows that disappearance can be real at one level and incomplete at another. The survival of Arctic-related ancestry in later peoples also forces a broader respect for continuity. Archaeological names are modern labels. They are useful, but they are not the names people necessarily used for themselves. When archaeologists say one culture ends and another begins, they are describing changes in material patterns, tools, houses, burials, settlement forms, and technologies. But living communities are not made only of artifacts. They are made of kinship, memory, adaptation, and descent. A change in harpoon design may mark a major historical shift, but it does not automatically mean every person vanished. A new ancestry may enter a region, but it does not always erase those already there. What survives in the record suggests both loss and entanglement. This matters because the question of the first Americans cannot be solved by looking only for pure lines. Human history is rarely pure. It is braided. The earliest peoples of the Americas gave rise to descendants, but their descendants met other groups, changed languages, shifted technologies, moved into new lands, and endured later migrations. Some lineages became dominant, others became faint, some were lost entirely. Others survived so quietly that only ancient DNA can detect them. In the Arctic, where the cold both preserves and destroys, this truth becomes unusually visible. The people who seem to vanish from the Arctic record do not vanish in a single way. Some may have died out, some may have left no descendants, some may have contributed ancestry that persists in living populations. Some may have been remembered in stories whose antiquity cannot be measured with the laboratory. Some may survive only as a genetic trace in people who also descend from many other histories. The first Americans, too, exist in this layered state, partly archaeological, partly genetic, partly ancestral, partly lost, partly alive. The North teaches that disappearance is not always the opposite of survival. Sometimes it is the form survival takes after the world has changed too much for the old names to remain. The lesson from the Arctic reaches far beyond ice and sea mammal camps, because the same problem appears wherever ancient bones enter the modern world. A skeleton is never only a skeleton, it is evidence, yes, but it is also a person. It may be studied as anatomy, dated as material, sequenced as DNA, measured as data, and placed into arguments about migration, ancestry, law, and identity. But before all of that, it was a living body that moved through a landscape, felt hunger and pain, knew other people, and died in a world that was not waiting to become an archaeological debate. Few discoveries have made this tension clearer than the ancient remains found beside the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, in 1996. At first, the find seemed almost accidental in the ordinary way discoveries often begin. Human bones appeared along the riverbank, exposed by erosion and noticed not by a grand expedition, but by people in a place where land, water, and modern recreation overlapped. The remains turned out to be extraordinarily old, roughly 8,500 to 9,000 years in age, and unusually complete for North America, in a field where early skeletons are rare, fragmentary, and often poorly preserved. Such a discovery carried immense scientific weight. Here was not just a tool, not just a footprint, not just a camp surface. Here was a human being from the early Holocene, a person who lived after the first great expansion into the Americas, but still close enough to the deep beginning to seem capable of answering old questions. The man became widely known as Kenyuk Man, though many native communities call him the Ancient One. That difference in naming is not a small matter. One name comes from a modern place of discovery and from the language of scientific and public attention. The other carries the weight of kinship, respect, and ancestral presence. From the beginning, several Columbia Plateau tribes saw the remains not as an object to be claimed by science, but as an ancestor who should be returned and reburied according to tribal traditions. Scientists, meanwhile, argued that such a rare and ancient skeleton could provide crucial information about the earliest population history of the Americas. The result was not a calm disagreement. It became one of the most intense legal and ethical conflicts in American archaeology. At the center of the dispute was a law meant to address a long history of Native American remains being collected, stored, displayed, and studied without consent. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, often shortened to NAGPRA, created a process for returning human remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribes. To many indigenous communities, this law represented a partial correction of a deep injustice. For generations, ancestral bodies had been treated as specimens rather than relatives. Museums and institutions held thousands of remains, often removed from graves or sacred places under conditions that would never have been accepted for the dead of more powerful communities. Against that history, the Ancient One was never simply a scientific opportunity. He was part of a larger struggle over dignity, authority, and who has the right to speak for the ancient dead. The scientific controversy deepened because early anatomical assessments suggested the skull did not look like those of many recent Native American populations in the region. Some researchers used terms and categories that now feel heavy with the older baggage of racial classification, including claims that the remains had features once described as Caucasoid. In popular culture, such claims quickly fed unsupported ideas that the earliest Americans might have been Europeans or some mysterious non-indigenous people, later replaced by Native Americans. This was a powerful example of how fragile evidence can become distorted when filtered through outdated typologies and public fascination. Skull shape can vary for many reasons, and it does not map neatly onto modern racial categories. The evidence remains incomplete when bones are interpreted without genetics. Cultural context and humility. For years, the Ancient One stood at the intersection of science and sovereignty. The tribes wanted reburial. A group of scientists sued for the right to study the remains. Courts became involved. Access was contested. Reports were written. The body of one ancient man became a battleground over the peopling of a hemisphere. It is difficult to overstate how uncomfortable this should feel. The desire to learn is real. The scientific value was real. But so was the pain of native communities watching an ancestor held in legal limbo while strangers debated whether he counted as one of theirs. In older archaeology, Indigenous oral histories and claims of connection were too often dismissed as belief, while scientific measurements were treated as neutral truth. The Kenyuk case forced that imbalance into public view. Then ancient DNA changed the ground beneath the argument. Genetic analysis showed that the Ancient One was more closely related to Native Americans than to any other living population tested. In particular, the results linked him broadly to indigenous peoples of the Americas and showed affinity with native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. This did not mean DNA could identify him with perfect precision as a direct ancestor of one modern tribe in a simple family tree sense. Human populations move and mix across thousands of years, and no genetic result can fully capture cultural belonging. But it did overturn the claim that he represented a separate, non-native population unrelated to indigenous America. The old anatomical interpretations, once presented by some as evidence of mystery outsiders, could no longer carry that burden. The conclusion was profound. The Ancient One was not proof of a lost European America, not evidence of a vanished non-indigenous race, not a wedge separating the continent's ancient dead from living native peoples. He belonged within the deep and complex ancestry of indigenous America. After the DNA findings, the path opened for repatriation, and his remains were returned to the tribes who claimed him and reburied. In that act, a long scientific and legal conflict came to a close. Though the questions it raised did not disappear, they continue wherever ancient remains are studied, wherever communities ask for ancestors back, and wherever researchers must balance knowledge with respect. The Kennewick case also changed the way the broader public understood the phrase First Americans. For decades, some popular theories had treated early skeletons with unusual skull shapes as signs of lost peoples unrelated to Native Americans. These ideas often gained attention because they sounded dramatic, but drama is not evidence. Ancient DNA has repeatedly shown that early remains in the Americas generally fall within the deep ancestry of indigenous peoples, even when their bodies do not fit older expectations based on skull measurements. This does not mean every early population was identical or that there were no lost branches. It means the story is not a simple replacement of mysterious outsiders by later native peoples. The real story is older, more continuous, and more complicated. There is a surprising human detail in the Ancient One's bones that can easily be forgotten beneath the legal and genetic debate. He had lived with injuries. A stone projectile point was lodged in his hip, and bone had grown around it, meaning he survived the wound for a long time. He was not merely an ancient data source. He had endured violence or accident, healed, carried pain, and continued living. His skeleton recorded not only ancestry, but a biography written in trauma and survival. That small fact returns him from abstraction. Before he became a case, before he became a headline, before he became a symbol, he was a man who survived a serious wound near the Columbia River world of the early Holocene. The identity debates around the Ancient One reveal why disappearance is never only a scientific question. To ask whether the first Americans disappeared is also to ask who's been allowed to define them. Archaeology once too easily separated ancient remains from living indigenous peoples when the bones looked unfamiliar or when the data seemed uncertain. Genetics has corrected some of these mistakes, but science alone cannot repair the deeper history of treating ancestors as objects. What survives in the record suggests continuity and change. Together, ancient bodies may look different from modern expectations. Early lineages may branch and merge, and cultures may transform, but none of that gives permission to erase the living peoples whose histories reach into those depths. The Ancient One stands, then, as both evidence and warning. He shows how powerful a single skeleton can be, how quickly interpretation can be shaped by assumptions, how DNA can overturn older claims, and how ethical responsibility must stand beside curiosity. His story does not solve the mystery of the first Americans. It sharpens it. It reminds us that the earliest people of the continent were not puzzles, waiting passively to be solved by the present. They were ancestors. And the question of what happened to them must be asked with care, because some of the people once described as vanished are still here in the bodies, communities, and histories of their descendants. The story becomes even stranger when the evidence stops behaving like a straight line and begins to show faint signals from directions no one expected. After Beringia, after the breaking of Clovis certainty, after Monte Verde and the drowned coasts, one might imagine that the genetic map would eventually settle into a clear pattern Northeast Asian routes, a pause or separation somewhere near Beringia, then a rapid expansion into North and South America. That broad outline still matters. It remains the foundation of mainstream understanding, but within it there are anomalies, small signals that do not overthrow the story, yet refuse to disappear from it. One of the most intriguing is often called Population Y. The name itself sounds more mysterious than it should. It does not refer to a known tribe, a discovered skeleton, or a lost civilization with monuments waiting under jungle vines. It is a statistical signal, a trace in genomes. First noticed when researchers compared DNA from indigenous peoples of the Americas with populations around the world. Some indigenous groups in South America, especially in parts of Amazonia, appeared to share a small but detectable genetic affinity with peoples related to Australasians, including groups from places such as New Guinea, Australia, and the Andaman Islands. This did not mean they were descended directly from recent Australians or Papuans. It did not mean boats crossed the Pacific in some dramatic late Ice Age voyage and founded Amazonian peoples. Those are the kinds of claims that become exciting too quickly and accurate too slowly. The evidence is subtler than that, and more difficult. Population Y is best understood as a clue to ancient population structure somewhere before or during the peopling of the Americas. The signal may point to a deeply rooted group in Asia that was related, in some distant way, to the ancestors of Australasians, and that also contributed a small amount of ancestry to some early Americans. If that sounds complicated, it is because the human past was complicated. Asia during the late Pleistocene was not a smooth genetic landscape occupied by a few cleanly separated populations. It was a vast continent of mobile hunter-gatherers, archaic human legacies, regional groups, extinctions, mixtures, and lineages that later vanished or were absorbed. Some ancestral populations that once existed in Asia may no longer survive in unmixed form anywhere. Their only evidence may be the faint echoes they left in later peoples. This is why the Population Y signal is so important. It hints that the ancestors of the first Americans may have drawn from a more diverse Northeast Asian or broader Asian source world than once imagined. The founding population that moved into Beringia may already have carried within it traces of older structure. Some branches of that structure may have expanded into the Americas, others may have disappeared from Asia, leaving no easy comparison population today. When geneticists find an affinity between Amazonian groups and Australasian-related peoples, they may not be seeing a direct route from the South Pacific to South America. They may be seeing the shadow of an older population that contributed ancestry in different directions long before modern geography made those connections seem unlikely. The puzzle deepens because the signal is not evenly spread across the Americas. If a clear Australasian-related ancestry had entered with the main founding population and spread uniformly, researchers would expect to see it widely among indigenous peoples of North, Central, and South America. Instead, it appears more strongly in some groups and weakly or not at all in others. That unevenness raises difficult questions. Did a small ancestry component arrive with one early branch that moved rapidly into South America? Was it present in an early population that later became mostly replaced or diluted elsewhere? Did complex mixture in the Americas amplify the signal in some regions and erase it in others? Scholars still debate the best explanation, and the evidence remains incomplete because ancient genomes from key times and places are still limited. ancient DNA has added new tension to the puzzle. Some early remains from South America have shown patterns that complicate older assumptions about a simple expansion. Certain ancient individuals from Brazil, for example, have been discussed in connection with this deep affinity, though interpretations have shifted as new samples and methods appear. The important point is not that one skeleton solves the mystery. It is that the genetic landscape of early South America seems to preserve traces of deep diversity, movement, and perhaps population structure that standard migration maps struggle to capture. South America was not just the far end of a route. It was a place where early populations spread quickly, diversified, interacted, and left signals that still challenge easy models. The temptation, of course, is to turn population Y into a dramatic lost people, a vanished race crossing oceans, a hidden migration from Australia, a secret chapter suppressed by cautious academics. But that temptation should be resisted. The actual science is more interesting than the fantasy. There is no solid evidence for a late Pleistocene fleet crossing from Australasia to South America and creating the first Americans. There is no need to imagine an advanced lost civilization or a replacement story detached from indigenous ancestry. The signal is small, ancient, and embedded within Native American populations, not outside them. It points to complexity in ancestry, not to the erasure of indigenous belonging. One of the lesser-known lessons of population Y is that related to does not mean from. In genetics, populations can share ancestry because one descended from another, but also because both descend from an older unsampled population. Two branches can resemble each other not because one travelled directly to the other's homeland, but because both preserve different pieces of a deeper ancestral tree. Imagine two leaves far apart on a forest floor. Their distance does not mean one leaf blew from the other. They may have fallen from branches connected higher up, on a tree whose trunk is no longer visible. Population Y may be one of those hidden branches, not a direct migration line across the ocean, but a remnant of older structure preserved unevenly in later peoples. This also changes how disappearance is understood. If population Y represents ancestry from a group that no longer exists in an identifiable form, then one population can vanish from the world while its traces survive in others. It may disappear as a separate people, as a language, as a toolkit, as a recognizable archaeological culture, and still remain faintly alive in genomes thousands of years later. Or the reverse may happen. A people may leave tools and camps but little detectable genetic legacy, because later population changes reduce their ancestry beyond recognition. Deep history is full of these mismatches. Archaeology and DNA often speak to each other, but they do not always say the same thing at the same volume. The Amazonian connection is especially striking because it reminds us that the deepest American story does not belong only to the far north. Beringia may be the entry zone, but the mysteries of ancestry are distributed across the hemisphere, in tropical South America, where heat and humidity often destroy ancient DNA. Living genomes can preserve clues that bones do not. Forests that seem archaeologically quiet may hold histories in people rather than in stone, rivers, uplands. And interior networks may have carried lineages whose material traces remain difficult to find. The silence of the ground is not always the silence of ancestry. Population Y does not overturn the main story of the first Americans. It complicates it in exactly the way real evidence often does. The first peoples of the Americas still appear most closely tied to Northeast Asian ancestry, shaped by a period of separation before expansion through Beringia and into the hemisphere. But within that ancestry may have been older threads, some connected to populations whose relatives also contributed to peoples far across the world. The first Americans were not a blank, simple founding line. They were already the result of older human histories before they ever entered the Americas. And so this strange signal becomes another reminder that disappearance is rarely absolute. Some peoples vanish as names, bodies, languages, and visible cultures, yet leave molecular traces carried by descendants who may not know that one tiny part of their ancestry points toward an ancient population science has only begun to infer. Population Y is not a lost civilization waiting to be uncovered with golden temples and impossible maps. It is something quieter and more haunting. A statistical footprint, a deep ancestry shadow, a sign that the people who first entered the Americas carried with them not only tools and fire, but the tangled inheritance of Asia's vanished Ice Age populations. The mystery does not become smaller under this light, it becomes older. The deeper the evidence becomes, the less the story resembles a solved case. That may feel strange at first, because every new method seems to promise finality. Radiocarbon dating gives numbers, DNA gives branching diagrams, sediment analysis gives environmental context, footprints give bodies in motion, stone tools give human action. Each discovery appears, for a moment, to pull the ancient world into sharper focus, yet the focus never stays still. A date is refined, a layer is reinterpreted. A genome reveals a branch no one expected. A coastline once ignored becomes central. A site once doubted gains strength, while another once celebrated becomes more uncertain. The science of the first Americans has advanced enormously, but it has not advanced toward simplicity. It has advanced toward a more honest kind of complexity. This is not a weakness. It is the nature of working at the edge of deep time. The first chapters of human life in the Americas were not written on durable monuments. They were written in mud, charcoal, bone collagen, broken stone, ancient teeth, shell fragments, plant fibers, river terraces, cave sediments, and the fragile chemistry of DNA. Every kind of evidence has its own way of speaking, and every one of those voices can be distorted. Radiocarbon dates must be calibrated and tied securely to human activity. Stone tools must be distinguished from natural fractures. Footprints must be dated through surrounding sediments, whose histories may be complicated. Ancient DNA must survive contamination, degradation, uneven sampling, and the ethical responsibilities of studying ancestral remains. The evidence remains incomplete, not because researchers have failed to look carefully, but because the surviving record is partial by its very nature. For much of the older debate, certainty often came from exclusion. If a site seemed older than Clovis, it was doubted. If a skeleton looked different from modern expectations, it was sometimes treated as evidence of a separate people. If a route seemed impossible on one map, it was removed from consideration. But the field has learned, sometimes painfully, that the past does not always fit the categories built for it. Clovis was real, but not first. The ice-free corridor was real, but probably not the earliest main passage. Early skeletons could look morphologically varied and still belong within the deep ancestry of indigenous America. Coastal migration could be plausible, even when many of the best sites are underwater. Genetics could reveal continuity and disappearance at the same time. Every old certainty has had to make room for a larger pattern. The methods themselves have changed the questions. Earlier archaeology often asked where the first people appeared and what tools they carried. Newer research asks how populations split before entering the Americas, how long they may have remained in Beringia, how quickly they moved south, how many routes they used, how regional adaptations formed, how later migrations reshaped the North, and how early lineages survive or fade in living genomes. The old map had one arrow. The newer map has pauses, branches, coastlines, corridors, submerged shelves, ghost ancestries, population turnovers, and continuities that do not always match the tool record. It is harder to draw, but it is closer to how human history usually works. There is a surprising humility built into the best science of this field. Researchers can now sequence DNA from ancient remains and recover environmental clues from microscopic traces. Yet some of the most important answers may still be hidden beneath the ocean or locked in places where preservation has failed. A single new site can alter the timeline. A single well-dated coastal camp could strengthen one migration model over another. A single ancient genome from an underrepresented region could clarify whether a faint ancestry signal belonged to an early branch, a later mixture, or a vanished population whose homeland has not yet been found. Scholars still debate these questions because the debate is not just about interpretation. It is about missing evidence that may genuinely change the answer. This uncertainty can frustrate people who want the story to behave like a finished legend. Popular imagination prefers clean beginnings. It likes the first boat, the first footprint, the first spear, the first family crossing a bridge of land beneath the northern lights. But human expansions rarely unfold as single heroic moments. They are usually made of many small decisions spread across generations following animals, marrying into neighbouring groups, returning to a river, testing a plant, crossing a channel, surviving a winter, teaching a child the path to stone, remembering a place where shellfish can be gathered when inland hunting fails. Science struggles to capture that richness because it survives unevenly. The real beginning of the Americas may never be reduced to one exact date or one exact route. The most responsible answer, then, is not to pretend there is no mystery, and not to fill the mystery with unsupported claims. Fringe ideas often grow in the spaces where evidence is incomplete. Lost civilizations, impossible migrations, secret races, and dramatic replacement myths can appear attractive because they offer sharp lines where the real record offers gradients. But uncertainty is not permission to invent freely. It is an invitation to be precise about what is known, what is likely, what is possible, and what remains unsupported. The first Americans do not need fantasy to be astonishing. The grounded story is already extraordinary Ice Age people shaped by Northeast Asian ancestry, perhaps isolated for millennia in or near Beringia, entering a hemisphere through routes still debated, spreading with remarkable speed, adapting to nearly every environment on Earth, living through ecological collapse, and leaving descendants whose histories continue. There is also a moral dimension to uncertainty. For many indigenous peoples, the question of early presence is not merely scientific curiosity, it touches ancestry, land, sovereignty, and the long history of outsiders claiming authority over native origins. Archaeology and genetics can offer powerful insights, but they must not be used to detach ancient people from living communities simply because the data are complex. The fact that early populations moved, mixed, branched, and changed does not weaken indigenous belonging. It shows the depth of it. Continuity across thousands of years does not require a people to remain unchanged. In fact, the ability to change is often what makes continuity possible. The mystery of disappearance looks different under this kind of science. Some early archaeological patterns truly ended, some lineages likely faded, some communities may have been lost entirely. Some ways of life vanished when mammoths disappeared, when seas rose, when forests advanced, when roots failed, when populations merged, when new technologies spread, and when the fragile record stopped preserving the evidence. But the oldest Americans did not simply vanish like smoke. Parts of them survived in later peoples, in inherited DNA, in regional adaptations, in deep relationships with land, and perhaps in cultural memories whose antiquity cannot be measured with instruments. Other parts are gone beyond recovery, and good science must be able to say that too. What remains is a story that keeps changing because it is still being found. The first Americans stand at the edge of several sciences at once: archaeology, genetics, geology, climatology, oceanography, anthropology, and indigenous knowledge. Each field adds light from a different angle, and the shadows shift as the light changes. The result is not a final portrait, but an image becoming slowly clearer without ever becoming simple. The continent was entered earlier than once believed. The routes were probably multiple, or at least more complex than the old corridor model. The people were connected to living indigenous ancestries, yet not all early branches survived equally. Some disappeared as distinct populations, some transformed, and some remain hidden because the ground, the sea, and time have not given them back. Science without final certainty is not failure. It is the only honest way to listen to a past that has survived in fragments. By the time all the clues are gathered, the mystery no longer looks like a simple vanishing. It looks like a long transformation spread across ice, coast, forest, river, bloodline, memory, and loss. The first Americans did not arrive as a single tribe with one tool, one route, one language, and one fate. They came out of older worlds in Northeast Asia and Beringia, carrying ancestry already shaped by deep time. They moved through a northern land that later drowned. They entered a hemisphere still half locked by ice. They followed opportunities the land allowed, perhaps along coasts rich with marine life, perhaps later through interior corridors, certainly along rivers, valleys, shorelines, plains, and mountain edges. They spread faster than older models expected, but not as a faceless wave. They spread as families, bands, alliances, children, elders, hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, healers, mourners, and people learning a continent one place at a time. The old question asks why they disappeared, but the first answer must be that many did not. Their descendants live on in indigenous peoples across the Americas. Ancient DNA, for all its limits and ethical burdens, has made that continuity harder to deny. Early remains once treated as mysterious outsiders have repeatedly shown deep relationships to Native American ancestry. The Anzic child, the Ancient One, ancient genomes from Alaska and other regions, and genetic patterns across living communities all point toward a past in which the earliest peoples of the hemisphere are not cut off from the present. The line is not simple. It bends, branches, narrows, mixes, and sometimes fades. But it is there. Yet saying they did not disappear is not the same as saying nothing was lost. Much was lost. Some early lineages may have vanished as distinct populations. Some communities likely died out locally, overwhelmed by isolation, ecological change, demographic fragility, or the breaking of social networks. Some cultural traditions ended when the animals, landscapes, and routes that sustained them changed beyond recognition. The Clovis world, with its dramatic stone points and Ice Age associations, did not continue unchanged. The mammoths vanished, the mastodons vanished, Horses and camels disappeared from their native continent. Giant sloths, armored glyptodonts, and ancient predators faded into extinction. The people who had known those animals had to become different people, because their world had become a different world. This is the hidden shape of survival. To survive deep change, a community may have to stop looking like its former self. A tool tradition may be abandoned not because the people are gone, but because the old tool no longer answers the new problem. A migration route may disappear under the sea, but descendants of the people who used it may continue inland. A genetic branch may become faint not because every person in it died, but because their children and grandchildren joined other groups, married into other communities, and carried ancestry forward in diluted or rearranged form. What survives in the record suggests that disappearance in the ancient Americas was often partial, uneven, and layered. The continent itself helped create the illusion of disappearance. It drowned the old Beringian world beneath northern seas. It swallowed coastal camps under rising oceans. It broke river terraces, buried hearths, scattered bones, and erased organic tools made from wood, hide, fibre, and bone. It preserved stone better than baskets, points better than songs, bones better than names. Archaeology sees what time permits it to see, and time is not a neutral curator. It favours certain materials, certain landscapes, certain accidents. A people can seem absent because they lived in the wrong place for preservation, or because they made the wrong kind of things for archaeology to find. The first Americans also challenged the modern desire for clean categories. They were not one people in the way later maps might make them appear. They were connected populations spreading into different worlds, adapting rapidly and regionally. Some became coastal foragers, some followed herds, some lived near lakes, wetlands, or river valleys. Some entered forests, deserts, highlands, and tropical landscapes. Over generations, their descendants became many peoples. Not a single frozen remnant of an ice age beginning. To call them vanished simply because they changed would be to misunderstand what human history is. And yet there is a real sadness in the parts that cannot be recovered. No one knows the names spoken at Monte Verde. No one knows what stories were told beside fires in Beringia. No one knows what children were taught when mammoths still crossed the plains, or how people explain the disappearance of animals that had once seemed permanent. No one knows how many small groups failed during bad winters, how many camps were abandoned for the last time, how many languages ended without leaving a trace, how many ancestors were absorbed into later peoples so completely that only a faint genetic signal remains. Scholars still debate the details because the evidence remains incomplete, and some losses are so old that no method may ever fully restore them. Still, incompleteness is not emptiness. The record that remains is extraordinary. Footprints in ancient mud, a camp preserved in wet Chilean ground, stone points shaped with breathtaking skill, bones carrying old wounds, children buried with care, genomes that reveal branches, pauses, and migrations, living ancestry that links the deep past to the present. Each clue resists the idea that the first Americans were simply erased. They were not an unsuccessful experiment at the edge of the world. They were the beginning of human life in a hemisphere, and that beginning continues through change. The mystery, then, is not solved by choosing disappearance or survival. It requires both. Some first Americans disappeared as distinct communities. Some vanished into the sea level rise that buried their camps. Some disappeared from archaeology when their tools changed. Some disappeared genetically when small lineages merged into larger populations. Some disappeared in the cruelest sense, through death and local extinction. but many survive through descendants, through adaptation, through mixture, through movement, through the living peoples whose histories reach far deeper than any written archive. The first Americans were never only first, they were also ancestors. They were not only migrants, but inhabitants. They were not only hunters of lost beasts, but makers of memory in a changing land. Their story begins in ice and drowned ground, but it does not end there. It continues in the Americas themselves, in communities whose presence proves that ancient transformation is not the same as absence. The mystery remains because the earliest chapters are damaged, but the central truth has become clearer. The people did not simply vanish into the past. They became part of the future, even as time carried away the names, camps, animals, coastlines, and worlds by which they first knew themselves. The land is quiet now where many of those first traces were made. The old lake beds dry under modern skies. The drowned shores lie beneath the sea. The mammoth paths are grass, forest, desert, street, farm, riverbank, and memory. If a person stands on one of those landscapes today, there may be no sign of the ancient footfall beneath them, no visible mark of the fire that burned there, no outline of the shelter, no sound of the people who once watched the weather and waited for morning. Time does not always destroy with violence. Often it removes the past gently, grain by grain, season by season, until only the faintest evidence remains. But faint does not mean meaningless. A footprint can outlast a body. A bone can carry a wound across 9,000 years. A child's genome can reopen a continent's history. A stone point, lost or left behind, can hold the memory of hands that shaped it with patience and risk. These are small survivals, but human history is often made from small survivals. The first Americans remind us that the past is not a clean sequence of arrivals and endings. It is a web of endurance, loss, adaptation, and inheritance. They lived through a world changing faster than many generations could understand. Ice retreated, seas rose, animals vanished, forests moved, roots failed, new lands opened, old places disappeared under water. In that upheaval, people changed because they had to. Some stories ended, others were carried forward in altered form. That is why disappearance, in deep history, is such a difficult word. It can mean death, it can mean migration, it can mean memory becoming too old to name. It can mean descendants surviving under new identities, in new lands, with new tools and new ways of speaking to the world. The first Americans are still partly hidden, and perhaps they always will be. The sea keeps some of their camps, the soil keeps some of their bones. Living peoples carry parts of their inheritance in ways science can glimpse but never fully own. What remains is not a closed mystery, but a doorway into humility. Human beings are fragile, but not easily erased. Their worlds can vanish, their names can be lost, their animals can disappear, and still something of them may continue. In the end, the image that lingers is not an empire falling or a city burning. It is a line of footprints crossing wet ground in an ice age morning, moving toward a horizon that no longer exists, left by people who could not know that the earth would remember them.